Good day, everybody. My name is DANY PEN, and I am super excited to be able to share with you all my presentation today. I grew up in the western side of the world. My family arrived as Cambodian refugees to America. I have family in both Canada and the United States, and so I was able to navigate both spaces and see how similar or different each country was when educating colonial history. The oppression of the other, the white status quo, and the social classicism revolved around race and color. I was very aware of the box other when I had to fill out forms. I was also very aware of the term exotic as a person of color growing up. I was also very aware of being told that I was a minority that needed to fit in. Today, I will be speaking on the design of selling violence and people of color, POCs, using Cambodia as a starting point for my presentation. For over 100 years, the country of Cambodia has witnessed and experienced numerous civil wars, violent uprisings, and attacks from other nations wanting to colonize it. And one man would actually lead a resistance to end colonialism, but instead, he became a tyrant. He would be known as Pol Pot, but in fact his true name was Salazar. The Khmer Rouge Party, under his leadership, saw the death of over 2 million people, killed in order to eradicate foreign colonial influences in Cambodia. To understand the development of Pol Pot's xenophobic attitude, as well as the history of violence and colonialism in Asia, we will explore how colonialism was designed to sell violence and people of color, POCs. We will examine propaganda poster designs and how marketing images were used as a tool to enforce dangerous ideologies such as white supremacy, the institution of racism, slavery, and the oppression of the other, also known as POCs. I'm going to start off this presentation sharing with you all a very important moment in Salazar's life that would explain the Khmer Rouge atrocity that would later happen in his life. So in 1949, at the age of 24 years old, Salazar, also famously known as Pol Pot later in life, he was sent to France like so many other young Cambodian students who were also forced into colonial assimilation and education by the French colonial government. He arrived in Paris with the other Cambodian students, and their first step out of the train, they were greeted by a giant tableau and statues, one of which was of a young Cambodian girl, naked to the waist down, exhibited amongst what was titled "Our Possessions in Asia." The other tableaus reinforce stereotypes of Cambodia as childish, exotic, and sexually adventurous. As a Khmer child, I was only given imagery and information about my culture, community, and history through the Western colonial lens. I was also taught my people endured a genocide committed by my own people, the Khmer Rouge, that we were at fault for our own trauma, pain, and suffering. Images of mass graves, piles of bones, prison cells, and killing fields populated the online world of Google Images when you search Cambodia. These are often the first images you see of Cambodia. Everywhere I looked, books, film, documentaries, it depicted the leader of the Khmer Rouge regime, Pol Pot, a Cambodian man, as the most evil man in history. As a child, this idea that this man, who was my kind, by blood, by culture, by history, is seen as the most evil human being who ever lived and was grouped with Hitler and Mao. This was what I was taught, and so I questioned myself, if this man was so evil, and he shares the same being as me, as a Khmer Cambodian person, does that mean I share the same wickedness in my veins, in my blood, in my being? And so I started to research who was this man, Pol Pot, And why did the atrocity of a genocide occur that saw over 2 million people killed, which included my own family members? Like, why would he kill his own people, his own family? It absolutely made no sense to me. I then started coming across archival photos during my research. It was so bizarre to me to see photographs of him smiling alongside other Cambodians and still calling them brothers and sisters, as you would in the Cambodian culture. I was never taught about Asian politics, and all I ever knew about communism was that it was this horrible thing and Western democracy is what you should strive for. In looking at the photographs, I couldn't understand how this photograph was the definition of communism. Then I came across this photo of one of the most evil men in history. It's a family photo of Pol Pot with his family. This photograph replicates my own family photo. How is it that his family photo is so much like my own family photo, filled with smiles, joy, love, and family members, and their faces a mirror of my own face? How is this man capable of such violence? And so I returned back to these images, and I began digging deeper and further back into my own history, the Cambodian history. I started questioning, where did Pol Pot learn such permissible violence, and what happened in his life where such behavior of violence and torture was needed to impose on over 2 million lives? So I returned back to this moment in Salazar's life, to this slide here. I want to address diversity, identity versus role confusion. Upon arriving in Paris, Salazar and the other Cambodian students stepped out of the train only to be greeted by giant tableaus and statues, one of which was of the young Cambodian girl, naked to the waist, exhibited amongst what was titled Our Possessions in Asia. Salazar and his fellow peers would become subjected to those stereotypes while studying in France. According to Erickson's theory, identity versus role confusion are the conflicts concerning the self that adolescents must face when entering adulthood. Recognizing one's identity is crucial to the development of adolescence because it can help with major personality achievements and to become an adult who is productive and content. When one cannot construct or define their identity, this can cause confusion and lack of preparation for the challenges of adulthood in establishing abilities and desires. For Erickson, his theory, the development of identity is a process followed by commitment, and this can include gathering information about themselves and their environment in order to create a self-structure. For Salazar, he became uninterested in his studies in France and loses his scholarship and instead becomes interested in his Cambodian identity. According to Holzheiser's and Wolff's ideology of antagonism, the identity of the individual is influenced by the perception of the self in conflict with the other. The foreign other, in Sar's case, was the French. While still in France, Salazar joins the communist Marxist group with other Cambodian students to support their needs for self-affirmation as Cambodians. But the statue of the little girl was not alone in its presentation. Beside it were 6 other cast iron statues representing 6 continents and the treasures of French colonialism. These were created for the Paris World Expo in 1878, originally installed at Palais du Trocadero and later stored at Nantes. The continent's statues were returned to Paris and were later placed in front of the Musée d'Orsay in 1985. The Asia statue was created by Alexander Falguere. Anti-colonialism in Cambodia originated as far back as 1876, when the French first invaded and colonized the country. And then we even have the history going further back when the Spanish and the Portuguese also tried to colonize Cambodia. Colonialism in Asia was a bloody and violent one that included slavery, village pillages, mass murders, and imprisonment. Children were also kidnapped, separated from their families, and placed in residential or assimilation schools where they were forced to learn the colonialist language and culture. In Cambodia, many of the Khmer Métis children were actually sent away to France and completely separated from their families therefore. Colonialism is not only enforced through physical warfare and attacks, but also through the design of imagery that is circulated. This form of violence is psychological and emotional, where it attacks colonized groups by depicting them as the other, being less than, and needing saving. The superiors, heroes, gods, and goddesses shown are the white colonizers, and you must abide by the rules of your masters. As colonialism progressed in Asia, we then begin seeing industry versus inferiority. Once countries were fully colonized, overruled, and invaded, poster designs for tourism began. Images of the exoticism, leisure, and the Indiana Jones Adventure Explorer was marketed. Meanwhile, the people of color, POCs, were being enslaved, trafficked, and classified as domestic workers, servants, laborers, comfort women based on colorism, gifted social status, and sexual needs. This imagery would also promote sexual violence against women of color, where men would seek exotic women and children for their sexual pleasure and gratifications. During French colonialism in Cambodia, there was a strong emphasis on Cambodians becoming literate with the French culture, customs, and learning about technologies such as radio, electricity, and engineering. The conflict of competency is witnessed by Erickson's theory of industry versus inferiority, where children must develop a positive sense of self in terms of useful skills and tasks in order to respond to demands and challenges. When children do not develop their own unique capabilities, there lies the risk of inferiority, which results in children lacking confidence and a community that feels no self-value or self-worth. While images of POCs smiling and happily serving, the reality was that many were imprisoned in shackles and placed in underground prison caves and tunnels. Many were also shipped away to other colonized countries and termed as indentured slaves, as a way to create a divide amongst African slaves so that there would be no collective unity and opportunities for collective uprisings and rebellions. This image here is a drawing from 1885 depicting French troops in Vietnam capturing the former emperor of Vietnam named Ham Ne, who had gone into hiding during the Can Vong uprising against the French colonists. However, the French did not execute him when they did capture him. Instead, they shipped him to Nigeria to become a slave. Because uprisings by enslaved POCs were increasing in Asia and around the world, from America and the Caribbean islands, where they were sent as indentured slaves, the design and portrayal of POCs then began showing them as the other foreigners who had malicious intents and motives. Yellow skin, slanted eyes, long nails, and bucktooth imageries were used to degrade POCs. Then the Indochina War began. I was never taught about the Indochina Wars, and when I did start learning about it in my own research, it confirmed for me how much control colonialism had in terms of what education I received. I had learned about World War I and World War II, but I had no idea growing up that there were two other world wars in the East. The world wars I learned were about the Western fight. And never did I once learn about Asian countries banding together to wage war against colonialism. And so when the Indochina Rebellion began, colonial posters also began depicting POCs as violent, as the enemy, and needed to be killed on the spot. Recruitment posters became very aggressive, and the mission was to recruit soldiers to actually go and kill POCs. The image on the far right here, "We can do it," it is often associated with women's rights, but the origins of the poster design is actually rooted in colonial recruitment to get people to sign up to actually go kill POCs. The Indochina War saw a unique moment in history that is never shared in Western education, when Africa and Asia had a united front against colonialism. This here is a Chinese poster depicting solidarity between Asia and Africa. Here we have a poster of an African man holding a rifle, but the bottom is in Chinese reading, "Oppressed people of the world unite, resolutely oppose American imperialism." And this was published by the Shanghai Renmin Mishu Chibanshi publication. And then the design changed to depicting POCs going after white women. "Keep this horror from your home," is what it says on the poster, showing a Japanese man holding a knife to a white woman. The white woman here is seen as a victim and most vulnerable and needs to be protected in times of war. However, violence against women of color was promoted and encouraged. The imagery of sexualizing, objectifying, using, and even experimenting on women of color was seen as permissible. So we go back to the 6 statues in Paris called the Treasures of Colonialism. All 6 statues depict naked POCs, women of color specifically, bearing spices, gold, silk, cotton, and many other riches claimed by French colonialism. These statues remain installed to this very day as public art. To those who do not know the origins of the commission will assume they are feminist, women empowerment sculptures, when in fact they depict women of color as sexual objects, enslaved and imprisoned in the colonial exhibition of our treasures. After the Indochina War, we then reach the Vietnam War, which is actually spawned from the Indochina War also. We continue to see solidarity amongst POCs in the colonized countries. We then have something I call collectivism, identifying the self with a group. According to Vygotsky, socio-cultural theory, the values and customs and skills of a cultural social group is passed on to the next generation by previous members. Social interactions play an important role for children in order for them to learn, receive knowledge from adults in their groups, master skills, and to create meaningful activities. A lot of cultures that have eldership, this is often, you can actually see this where the elders pass on that information to the children and the next generation. It is important for individuals to develop social interaction with others while at the same time build on the processes of self-construction. In collectivist societies, people tend to receive knowledge and skills from other members, thus defining themselves as being part of that group. So, going back to when I was mentioning that Salazar was, trying to affirm his identity as being Cambodian and connecting with other fellow Cambodians in France when they were enduring the racism and discrimination while studying in Paris. For Cambodia and many of the Asian societies, they are collectivist societies, unlike the West, which is an individualistic society. Collectivist societies stress group goals, and all experiences, whether emotional, physical, or psychological, to be affected and shared by all members of the group. Collectivist cultures that stress social interactions to achieve competency often rely on observational learning and practice in daily life. So you learn from the group that you're trying to fit in by observing, watching what they're doing, practicing it, learning it, and then perfecting the skill. According to Holsizer and Wolff's theory, in the development of social cognition, it is highly important for the individuals to identify their social identity and know which group they belong to. And this in itself will allow the individuals to view themselves positively by the extension of being in that group. So when they feel that, okay, I'm part of this group now, I can actually do all the skills, capabilities, and abilities of what that group culture is like, because I am now part of them. I am one of them. During the Vietnam War in the East, we also had the civil rights movement in the West. Again, we have solidarity posters, and in this one in particular, at the bottom in Chinese writing, it reads, "Yellow Peril supports Black liberation." The Archive of Asian Anti-Imperialism offers us Asian Americans, Canadians, another way of unlearning racism and settler colonial imperialism while educating our communities about the POC history. It's so interesting how history repeats itself also, because we are currently going through another civil rights movement. I strongly believe that. And we're seeing that Black and Asian solidarity happening again. So during the 1960s, during the civil rights movement in Asia, posters were also made to help fight against the South African apartheid and segregation in America. There were more imageries showing solidarity and unity amongst POCs. But why were these images absent in the Western education? Let's go back to Pol Pot right now and examine what happened in his childhood for him to become so anti-foreign and feel the need to impose such extreme violence to bring his idea of utopia to reality, which really turned into a dystopia. In 1976, Salazar declared himself as Pol Pot, a revolutionary name he gave himself that was actually imitated from previous communist leaders that he admired, such as Mao and Ho Chi Minh. And they themselves were also very anti-foreign and anti-colonialist. And they also changed their names during political revolutions. Salazar's imitation of previous communist dictators correlates with Vygotsky's theory of development, where he believes society offers opportunities for children to play make-believes, to represent cultural activities. For Salazar, his admiration and idolization of Mao and Ho Chi Minh saw him tracing steps and imitating decisions by previous communist leaders who were very anti-foreign and anti-colonialist. For Salazar, Pol Pot, he would go on to reiterate even quotes from Mao to his followers. The Khmer Rouge's mission originally was to renew Cambodia into a state free from foreign colonial ideologies. So what had happened was, when the French came in to colonize Cambodia, they would not allow the indigenous communities to preserve their identity and culture. There was a ban on speaking the language, preserving aspects of the culture. So there was a lot of erasures and control going on. And for Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge's mission, they wanted to get rid of these foreign colonial influences, which end up seeing the mass murder of over 2 million Cambodians. And his reasoning behind the killings of the Cambodians was that he believed that if someone was a supporter of colonial influences, that they themselves have been brainwashed and that they would not be a supporter of preserving the indigenous culture. This socialist model was extracted from communist techniques also enforced in China and North Korea, and was then imitated by Pol Pot in Cambodia. According to Staub's theory, humans view fulfillment as a need, and when they feel parts of them, whether it be their culture or social affiliation, are being oppressed, the need for fulfillment intensifies, and to obtain it, it can result in destructive behaviors. Salazar, and like many other Cambodians, felt their cultural identity was being suppressed by French colonialism, and therefore their need for fulfillment was threatened. Like many nationalistic ideologies, Salazar's development of the Khmer Rouge Party came about due to the idea of trying to make Cambodia a better place by promising a better future for the indigenous Cambodians. In Pol Pot's words, he says, "I want you to know everything I did for my country." During the Khmer Rouge regime from 1975 to 1979, thousands of victims were photographed. Their details such as their name, job occupation, and education were recorded, and then they were executed, amounting to over 2 million people killed. These are the images of victims that were collected by the Khmer Rouge regime as trophy-like documentations. And here we have something I term as fulfillment, imitation, and make-believe. Almost 100 years earlier, during the French colonization of Cambodia, Khmer people, the Cambodian people, were rounded up by the French, photographed, and their name, job occupations were recorded, and then they would be deemed as a slave or to be executed. All in the exact same manner. The Khmer Rouge and generations before them had learned the practice of oppression and violence from their colonizers. These photographs taken here are an exact replica, almost this exact same design as what the Khmer Rouge had. But these photographs here are archived at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France as their trophy documentations. When we look at these images through history, history is rooted in layers of subjective responses and perspectives. But there will always be a core truth to everything. What is the definition of truth? I find this answer best comes from a pragmatic approach with James Williams defining truth as something that agrees with reality, and falsity is disagreeing with reality. In an excerpt from Julia Kristaeva's collection of essays that taps onto the relation between psychosis and truth, she states, "There is a core truth to everything, except this core truth is wrapped in many layers of illusions, disillusions, all of which distorting the truth." In a major way, I feel memories often contribute to the distortion of truth. How many variations of stories of the genocide have I heard, each individual accounting their own experiences of it, what I've learned through the Western colonial lens of it. There's no denying a Holocaust occurred, for example, but most memories are subjective, vague, unclear, and inaccurate. In Pierre Nora's essay, History and Memory, he wrote, "Memory is life, born by living societies founded in its name. It remains in permanent evolution, open to the dialectic of remembering and forgetting, unconscious of its successive deformations, vulnerable to manipulation and appropriation, susceptible to being long dormant and periodically revived." I can probably list some significant memories that I remember and even revive a few for you. But in that moment of retrieving the memory, what aspects of it will I still remember if it had been dormant, repressed, or forgotten about for years? The revival will not be the same memory. There will be missing links. The best example I can give you in this instance is I can meet someone again who I met maybe a year or two ago. I've retrieved the memory of when and where I've met the person. I've successfully remembered them, except I can't remember his or her name. And because I can't recall their name, I start making guesses in my head and maybe even ending up attaching an assumed name for them. This is an example of what I mean by memories can become vague and, as Nora puts it, vulnerable to manipulation and appropriation. And here, as we look at this modern poster design, Trump's 2020 political campaign ad, do you see it referencing the historic design of violence? Actually, if you tap into your memory that, I just showed you in the previous slide a moment ago, this is actually referencing the historic design of violence with the "we want you" imagery. And if you've forgotten those images in your mind, here I have it up for you again. The colonial recruitment imageries of "we want you." Designed to go enact violence against POCs. The same propaganda design is being reused to stress the ideas of we are at risk of being attacked by the others, the foreigners, the outsiders. These are contemporary poster designs selling violence. But then we go to Biden's approach, where he is using the collective unity imagery, which I have shown you also in the previous slides on how history solidarities have been depicted. As we reflect on historic designs and how violence is enabled, encouraged, and sold to the mass, current day attitudes regarding colonialism has definitely shifted, in my opinion. There are leaders now looking to hold peace, help with healing, and work on reconciliations and reparations for POC communities. And we see this being amplified in a lot of the poster designs coming out today. POC voices are now being heard more than ever, and there are more channels and platforms for POCs to address their trauma, pain, and injustices. POCs are able to speak of the violence and abuse that their communities have also endured for generations. Poster designs are now showing advocacy and the call to action for accountability. POCs have bore the weight of generational pain, trauma, violence, and suffering. For so long, the image of POCs have been used, violated, abused, and exploited. We have been referenced as the other, the exotic, the less than, the minority, with no voice, power, or rights. As artists and designers, we hold the responsibility on how we create and display images in society. And we have to take accountability on how our designs impact and affect POC communities. The design of selling violence is a powerful tool that can take lives, erase cultures, and oppress communities for generations. It is here and now that I implore artists and designers to critically think when you create if your works cause harm or encourages healing. We do have the power to stop selling violence. Thank you for your time today, and I really hope this presentation engaged you on a critical level and has really given you an opportunity to really think about your position in the world today. Thank you.